The hum was the first thing you noticed at 3 in the morning. Not the beep of a distant monitor or the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum, but the low, electric thrum of the building itself, the sound of a place that never slept. Maya felt it in her teeth. 21 years old, 10 hours into a 12-hour shift, and the world had narrowed to this fluorescent-lit corridor, the smell of bleach, and the bone-deep weariness that had become her closest companion. She was leaning against the nurse's station, scrolling through a patient chart on a tablet that felt heavier than it should, when the quiet of the emergency bay was torn open. The automatic doors hissed apart to admit a gust of city air and a knot of silent, severe men in dark suits. They moved with a predatory grace that was utterly alien to the shambling rhythm of the ER, parting the usual late-night crowd of drunks and feverish children like a ship's prow through water. In their center, they supported a man who bled through the pristine white of his shirt, a dark flower blooming over his ribs. He was tall, his black hair threaded with surprising silver at the temples, and even leaning heavily on two of his men, he carried an aura of stillness that was more commanding than any shout. His face was a mask of controlled pain, his jaw tight, his dark eyes sweeping the room with an unnerving, analytical calm. They stopped at the triage desk. The nurse on duty, a veteran named Lena, looked up, her expression flattening into practiced neutrality. One of the suits spoke, his voice low and smooth. "We need your best surgeon. A private room." Now, Lena didn't flinch. "He needs to be registered." "What's the injury?" The man didn't answer. The injured man, the clear center of their universe, lifted his head. His voice was quiet, a low rasp of gravel, but it cut through the hum of the hospital.
No surgeons.
No 1 inch. The men around him tensed. Dr. Albright, the on-call resident with a face still too young for the exhaustion in his eyes, hurried over. "Sir, you're bleeding significantly. We need to examine you." He reached out a hand, and one of the bodyguards moved to block him with an almost lazy fluidity that was more threatening than overt aggression. The injured man waved a hand, a small, dismissive gesture. He was the eye of the storm, the quiet point around which all this anxious energy spun. He was, Maya realized with a sudden, cold certainty, a very powerful Japanese mafia boss. It wasn't just the suits or the deference. It was in the absolute certainty of his own authority, the way he held the room hostage with nothing more than his presence and his pain. "Get me a phone," he commanded one of his men, his voice strained. "And a secure line." "I will call my own physician," Albright sputtered. "Sir, that's against protocol. You could have internal bleeding, you could go into shock. We need to treat you." The Japanese mafia boss simply looked at him, a look of such profound, ancient dismissal that the young doctor physically recoiled. It was a look that said, "You are an insect, and I am tired of your buzzing." Maya watched the scene from the relative safety of her station, a strange mix of clinical detachment and weary frustration. This was a complication she did not need. This was paperwork and police reports and a level of drama that belonged on television, not in her already chaotic workplace. Lena caught her eye, a silent message passing between them. Here we go again. The city coughed up all sorts of nightmares, and their job was to stitch them up and send them back out into the dark. But this felt different. This man wasn't just a victim of the city. He was a force that shaped it. His refusal was absolute, a wall of sheer will. He was going to die on their floor out of pure, unadulterated stubbornness. "Sir," Maya heard herself say, her voice sounding louder than she intended in the charged silence. She pushed off the counter and walked toward the cluster of dark suits. Every eye, including the impossibly dark ones of the bleeding man, swiveled to her. She kept her hands loose at her sides, her expression neutral. She was just a nurse in light blue scrubs, a small, tired cog in this giant machine. "Dr. Albright is right. At this rate, your personal physician will be arriving to pronounce you dead." The main bodyguard took a half-step toward her. The Japanese mafia boss held up a hand, stopping him. He studied her, his gaze sharp enough to feel like a physical touch. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, not interest, more like faint surprise that one of the background figures had suddenly spoken. "And you are?" he asked, his voice a low vibration. The person who has to clean your blood off the floor if you collapse, she said, her tone flat. My name is Maya. I'm a registered nurse. And I'm telling you that you've got about 20 minutes of noble defiance left before you start losing consciousness. Maybe less, a ghost of a smile, so faint it was barely there, touched his lips. It did not reach his eyes. Call someone qualified, he said, the words a final, clipped dismissal. He was turning his head away, back to his men, back to his world of private physicians and unquestioned orders. Maya felt a surge of something she couldn't name, pity, anger, a professional's deep-seated offense at watching someone choose death over sense. It was a recklessness that mirrored a part of herself she tried to keep buried. Without thinking, without planning, she took a final step forward, right into his personal space. The bodyguard stiffened, hands moving inside their jackets. She ignored them. She looked directly at the powerful Japanese Mafia boss, and with a slow, deliberate motion, she pushed up the sleeve of her left scrub top. There, on the dark skin of her forearm, was a tattoo. It was a single, perfect rose, its petals inked in delicate shades of shadow and its stem thick with sharp, black thorns. It was a clean, precise image, a symbol of brutal beauty. The man's gaze dropped to her arm. The air left his lungs in a soft, audible hiss. His mask of control didn't just crack, it shattered. His eyes widened, locking onto the tattoo with an expression of raw, unadulterated disbelief. He knew what it was. He knew what it meant. And he knew that the last place on earth he should ever have expected to see it was on the arm of a young, tired nurse in a city hospital an ocean away from home. From Tatsuya's perspective, the world had become a tunnel of graying vision and the hot, wet reality of his own blood soaking his clothes. The voices of the hospital staff were meaningless noise, the buzzing of gnats. His focus was singular: get out, get secure, get his own doctor. Trust was a currency he had not dealt in for over 20 years, and he would not start now, bleeding out under the sterile gaze of strangers. He had built an empire on the foundations of control and calculated risk, and this, a random knife in a dark alley, was an unacceptable variable. His body was failing, but his will was a fortress. Then the nurse stepped forward. He had dismissed her, another uniform, another cog. But her voice had a core of steel beneath the fatigue. And then she showed him her arm, the rose. It was not just any rose. It was the mon, the crest, of the Haneda family, a clan bound to his own by a blood oath forged 3 generations ago in a firestorm of violence and betrayal. They were his most steadfast allies, a family known for their silent lethality and unwavering loyalty. To see their mark here, on her, was like finding a sacred text in a gutter. It was a paradox that his pain-fogged mind could not immediately solve. He looked from the tattoo to her face. He saw no guile, no deception. He saw only exhaustion and a defiant sort of competence. Her eyes, a warm, clear brown, held his gaze without fear. In his world, people looked at him with fear, or greed, or a carefully constructed mask of respect. No one looked at him like he was just a man, bleeding on their floor. This young woman did. She was not one of his people. She was not Japanese. She was an anomaly, a puzzle dropped into the middle of his crisis. And for the first time that night, a variable appeared that was not a threat, but a point of profound, arresting curiosity. His fortress of will, built to withstand armies and assassins, was breached by a 21-year-old nurse and a flower inked on her skin. His men were watching him, waiting for the order to remove her, to clear the scene. Dr. Albright was hovering, looking confused. Tatsuya took a breath, the movement sending a fresh, sharp signal of agony from his side. He ignored it. He looked at Maya, at the rose on her arm, and made a calculation that went against every instinct he had honed for decades. He was a powerful Japanese mafia boss, and he was placing his life in the hands of a complete stranger. "Proceed," he said. The word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a gavel. The world snapped back into focus. The bodyguards melted back, their tension easing but not vanishing. Dr. Albright looked relieved and utterly bewildered. Maya simply nodded, her expression giving nothing away. The professional was back in charge. "Get him into trauma bay too," she ordered, her voice crisp. "I need a full tray, sutures, wide-bore 4 and cross-match 4 units of oneg, stat." The world began to move again, but now it moved to her rhythm. As they transferred him to a gurney, his side screaming in protest, Tatsuya's eyes never left her. He watched the way she moved, efficient and sure. He watched her hands as she prepped in 4-line, her fingers long and steady. There was a deep, reassuring competence in her actions that soothed some primal, wounded part of him. In the trauma bay, under the glare of the surgical lamp, she worked. She cut away his expensive, ruined shirt with a pair of shears, her touch impersonal yet gentle. She cleaned the wound, her brow furrowed in concentration. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft click of metal instruments and the quiet beep of the heart monitor they'd hooked him to. He could feel the sting of the antiseptic, the pull of the needle as she administered a local anesthetic. Through it all, he watched her face.
She did not speak.
She did not ask the question that he knew was burning in her mind. "Where did you get that tattoo?" It was a question that could get a person killed. Her silence was a sign of a deeper understanding, a wisdom that seemed at odds with her youth. He was used to commanding fear. He was used to wielding power that could end lives with a single word. But in this small, sterile room, he was powerless. He was just flesh and blood, a man with a hole in his side, and she was the one with all the control. It was a novel sensation, and not an entirely unpleasant one. The quiet intimacy of the moment was profound. Her head was bent over his body, her focus entirely on the task of mending him. He could smell the faint, clean scent of hospital soap on her skin. He realized he didn't even know her last name. This woman, who wore the mark of his allies, who held his life in her steady hands, was a complete mystery. And Tatsuya, the powerful Japanese mafia boss who had not been surprised by anything in years, found himself utterly captivated. He was moved to a private suite on the top floor, the kind reserved for foreign dignitaries and billionaires. His men stood guard outside the door, turning the hospital corridor into a hostile border. They had tried to bring in a team of private nurses, but Tatsuya had refused. He wanted only her. Maya. The name was a soft sound, a counterpoint to the harsh angles of his life. Her shifts became his clock. He would watch the door, waiting for the quiet click of it opening, for her to enter with her calm efficiency. She would check his vitals, change his dressing, her touch always professional, her gaze always direct. They existed in a bubble of unspoken things. The tattoo on her arm remained a silent testament between them, a question mark he refused to ask and she refused to answer. He learned the rhythm of her presence. The soft squeak of her shoes, the way she would bite her lips slightly when concentrating on a difficult section of his bandage. He noticed the dark circles under her eyes and felt a strange, protective anger at the hospital for working her so hard. One afternoon, she was adjusting his pillows, her arm brushing his. He could see the rose clearly. "The artist was very skilled," he said, his voice quiet. It was the closest he had come to acknowledging it. She didn't stop her work. "He was the best," she said, her voice even. "It was a debt. Paid a long time ago, a debt. That made a certain kind of sense. The Haneda did not give their mark lightly. It was earned, usually with blood or a sacrifice of equal value. He wanted to know more. He wanted to know everything. What kind of debt had this young woman incurred that she paid for it with a permanent brand of allegiance to one of the most dangerous families in Tokyo?
But he didn't ask.
Prying was a weakness. It was a tool for interrogation, not for this. Whatever this was. He was the powerful Japanese mafia boss, a man who took what he wanted. But with her, he found himself waiting, hoping she would offer the information herself. It was a new and unsettling form of patience. He was healing, his body slowly knitting itself back together under her care, but he felt a different kind of wound opening inside him, a vulnerability he had not allowed himself in decades. Maya's life had developed a strange, bifurcated rhythm. There were the long, normal hours of her shift, dealing with fractures, fevers, and the endless, mundane suffering of a city hospital. And then there were the hours she spent in his room. The air inside was different, heavy with his stillness, the faint scent of expensive cologne warring with the ever-present smell of antiseptic. His men would nod at her, their faces unreadable stone. Inside, he would be waiting, either sitting in the chair by the window watching the city below, or propped up in bed reading. They spoke of trivial things. The terrible coffee, the drone of the traffic, the changing color of the leaves in the small park visible from his window. It was all a carefully constructed facade, a way to fill the silence that thrummed with the weight of what they weren't saying. One evening, she arrived to find a small, exquisitely wrapped box on the bedside table. "For you," he said, not looking up from his book.
She stopped.
"I can't accept gifts from patients. I am not a patient," he said, his eyes finally lifting to meet hers. "I am a man who appreciates good care." His gaze was intense, unwavering. Arguing felt futile, like arguing with a mountain. She opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of silk, was a canister of the finest loose-leaf tea she had ever seen. It was a gesture of immense wealth and quiet intimacy.
It was not a bribe. It was a statement.
Later, in the break room, Lena found her staring at the canister. "He's a complicated man, that one," Lena said, pouring herself a cup of burnt coffee. "He's just a patient," Maya lied. Lena smiled, a wise, weary expression. "Honey, no patient has ever had 4 men with guns in their ears standing guard outside his door."
"You're a good nurse, Maya."
"One of the best. But you've got a habit of walking toward fires just to see how hot they are. Be careful that one doesn't burn you." Maya knew she was right. She was no longer just his nurse. She was something else, something undefined. She was an anomaly in his world, and he was a dangerous gravity in hers, pulling her out of her ordinary orbit. The tea was a link, a tie, and she was not sure she wanted to break it. The attack, when it came, was not the loud, explosive violence Tatsuya had built his life around. It was silent and insidious. A rival faction, the Kudo clan, had learned of his presence, of his weakness. They would not risk a direct assault on the hospital, not with his men turning the floor into a fortress. Instead, they would be clever. They would find a crack. He knew this. He felt it in the subtle shift in the city's undercurrent, a tension he could read like the weather. His captain, a man named Ishida, stood by his bed, his report grim. "They've been watching the hospital staff. They know about the nurse." Tatsuya felt a cold fist clench in his gut. It was a feeling he recognized instantly. Fear. But it was not for himself. It was a sharp, terrifying blade of fear for her. For Maya. For the young woman with tired eyes and steady hands who had somehow walked into the center of his violent world, completely unaware. He imagined a threat touching her, and the rage that followed was so pure, so absolute, it almost choked him. He had spent a lifetime treating people as assets or obstacles. Maya was neither. She had become essential. He looked out the window at the city lights, a glittering, indifferent sprawl. He had conquered this city's shadows, bent them to his will. Yet he was helpless to protect this one woman from the world he had created. Keeping her close was a danger to her. Pushing her away felt like a kind of death. He saw her then, a small figure in blue scrubs walking down the long corridor toward his room, a small smile on her face as she chatted with another nurse. She was oblivious, a beacon of light in a world of gathering darkness. In that moment, watching her walk toward him, toward the danger he represented, his entire world reordered itself around a single, undeniable truth. The powerful Japanese mafia boss, the man who commanded armies and controlled fortunes, was terrified, not of his enemies, but of losing her. He had to send her away. The decision was agony, a self-inflicted wound far deeper than the one in his side. When Maya entered the room, the atmosphere was different. The calm stillness was gone, replaced by a brittle, dangerous tension. Tatsuya was dressed, not in hospital pajamas, but in a dark, perfectly tailored suit. He stood by the window, his back to her. Ishida and another guard were packing a small bag. "What's going on?" she asked, her hand hovering over the blood pressure cuff she was carrying. I am discharging myself, Tatsuya said, his voice flat and cold. He didn't turn around. The words hit her like a slap. You can't. Your sutures aren't ready to come out. You're still at risk for infection. My personal physician will handle it. It was the same dismissive tone he had used in the ER, the voice of the powerful Japanese mafia boss, not the man who had watched her with quiet intensity for the past week. It was a wall, and it hurt more than she would have expected. This is foolish, she said, her professional resolve kicking in. You're being reckless. He finally turned, and his eyes were chips of ice. Your services are no longer required. You will be compensated for your time. He was firing her. He was dismissing her like an employee. All the quiet moments, the shared silence, the gift of tea, it all evaporated under his cold gaze. But she saw something else, something behind the ice. A flicker of pain, a deep, guarded vulnerability. And Maya, who always walked toward the fire, took another step. Why? She asked, her voice quiet but firm. The simple question seemed to unmake him. His shoulders slumped, just for a second. The mask of the unfeeling crime lord cracked. He looked at her, and the coldness in his eyes was replaced with a raw, desperate honesty that was more shocking than any threat. Because your presence here has become a liability, he said, the words precise and brutal. And because I find I am no longer capable of treating you as one. He took a step closer, his gaze burning into her. In my world, Maya, there is no room for the things I feel when you are near. To be near me is to be a target. You are the only person who has seen me as a man and not a monster in a decade. Being near you is a danger I cannot permit, and a necessity I can no longer live without. So you must go. His confession hung in the sterile air of the hospital room, more real and more dangerous than the armed men by the door. It was not a declaration of love in any conventional sense. It was a statement of fact, a raw admission of a fatal flaw in his fortress of control. He was a powerful Japanese mafia boss, and he was laying his singular, devastating weakness at her feet. Maya looked at him, truly looked at him, past the suit and the reputation. She saw a man trapped in a life he had built, a man who saw kindness not as a gift, but as a threat. And she understood. She thought of her own past, of the debt her father had incurred to the Haneda family, a debt she had offered to pay in his place by serving them for a year back in Japan, learning their ways, their language, their codes of honor and violence. She had paid it, earned their respect, and escaped, vowing to build a life as far from that world as possible. She had become a nurse to heal, to mend, to counteract the breaking she had witnessed. And now, that world had found her again, in the form of this man. Her past and her present were colliding in this room. She could walk away. She could take his warning, run back to her life of quiet anonymity, and forget the man with silver in his hair and agony in his eyes. It was the sensible choice. It was the safe choice. She looked at the rose on her arm, the mark she had once considered a scar, a reminder of a life she'd left behind. Now it felt like a bridge. She met his gaze, her own resolve hardening into something new, something that was neither fear nor recklessness, but a clear-eyed choice. You're right, she said softly. I can't be your nurse anymore. Tatsuya's face tightened, bracing for the rejection he had orchestrated. But, she continued, her voice steady, if you are leaving, you can't go alone. You're still injured. You're still a reckless, stubborn man who needs someone to make sure he doesn't tear his stitches. A profound stillness fell over him. He searched her face, looking for any sign of coercion or fear. He found none. He found only her. Maya, he breathed her name, a prayer and a warning in one. You don't know what you're asking? I think I do, she said. I've seen your world before. I know the risks. She held his gaze, her entire future balanced on this single, impossible moment. So, the question isn't whether I should go. The question is, are you going to take me with you? The powerful Japanese mafia boss looked at the young nurse who had saved his life and then dismantled his soul, and for the first time, he surrendered completely. He stepped forward and gently took her hand, his thumb brushing over the inked petals of the rose. I am, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had long forgotten. And I will never let you go. He was not offering her a promise of safety or an easy life. He was offering her himself, his dangerous world, his broken heart. And in the quiet hum of the hospital, surrounded by the threat of death, Maya chose life.
His life. Theirs.